am not really into ghost stories or anything like that, but something happened to me last year that I still can't explain. I figured I had share my experience and see if anyone out there has had similar experience like that. Last summer, I was working as a security guard at an old abandoned hospital on the edge of town. I had taken the job as a way to make some extra cash over the summer break from my university. The hospital had been shut down over for a decade, and it was known for being creepy and, well, a little bit haunted. I was never one to believe in ghosts, but working there was unsettling to say the least. The job was pretty straightforward. My main responsibility was to walk the hallway every couple of hours and make sure nobody was breaking in or messing around. I worked the night shift, which ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The building was huge, with 4 floors, and there were plenty of dark corners and empty rooms. One night, things took a turn for the eerie. I started my shift as usual, making my rounds and checking the security cameras. The hospital was silent as ever, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the building and the windows cracking open in the wind. It was quiet, but it was a sort of unnerving quiet that made the hair on my back of my neck stand up. Around midnight, I was walking down the long, narrow hallway on the second floor when I noticed something strange. There was a door at the end of the hallway that had been locked, but now the door was slightly ajar, with just enough space to see into the darkness beyond it. I walked up to the door and pushed it open, half expecting to see something or someone in there. But there was nothing. The room was empty except for a few old dusty medical equipment scattered around in it. I checked the door's lock to make sure it was still intact, but everything seemed normal. I locked the door back up and continued on my rounds, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had started to creep in. A couple of hours later, while I was in the basement checking the storage rooms, I heard a strange noise coming from the stairwell. It was like a faint, echoing cry or a moan. I stood still for a few minutes, straining to hear it again, but it was gone, like it was never there. I walked up the stairs to investigate, but when I got to the landing, there was no one there, and nothing seemed out of place. The noise was so soft that I wondered if I had imagined it. I finished my rounds on the basement and went back up to the second floor. As I walked down the hallway again, I noticed the door at the end of the hall was ajar once again. My heart started to race. I knew I had locked it, but now somehow it was open. I took a deep breath and walked into the room, determined to check it out. The room was just as empty as before, but there was something off. It felt colder than the rest of the building. I shined my flashlight around and noticed a large old mirror on side of the room, but it was covered in dust, and the surface was so dirty that it was hard to see my reflection. I took a few steps closer to the mirror, and that's when I noticed something strange. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see a shadow figure behind me in the mirror. It looked like a person standing there, but when I turned around, the room was empty. I spun back to the mirror quickly, but the shadow was gone, and I can see no one behind me in the mirror. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or imagination of my disturbed mind, but the chill in the room was undeniable. I walked out of the room and shut the door behind me, locking it as I went. I continued my rounds, but my nerves were shot. Around 4 a.m., I was sitting in the security office, watching the security feeds on the monitors, when I saw something that made me jump. On one of the cameras, which was positioned in the hallway where the mysterious room was, I saw a dark figure moving from one end of the hallway to other. It was just a shadow, but it was moving in a way that no one walked before. I rewound the footage and watched it again, but the figure was gone. It was like it had never been there in the first place. I was beginning to feel more than a little freaked out. I tried to call a friend to talk, but the old building had a terrible cell reception and I couldn't get through. The rest of the shift was a blur. I kept checking the hallway and the room, but nothing else ever happened. When 6 a.m. finally came, I was relieved to be done for the night. I walked out of the building as the sun began to rise, feeling a sense of both dread and relief. The next day, I decided to do a bit of research on the hospital. I wanted to find out if there was any history that might explain the strange things I had experienced. I went to the local historical society and dug through some old archives. I found out that the hospital had a dark past. During the 1950s, there had been a series of mysterious deaths among the patients. Some people believed that it was due to neglect, but others said that something more sinister might have been going on. The hospital had been closed after a scandal was left to decay over the years. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. I had always thought that ghosts were just stories, but the things I experienced that night made me question everything. I tried to tell my coworkers about what happened, but they just laughed it off as my imagination. I eventually quit the job. I couldn't handle the feeling of being watched and the eerie events that seemed to happen only when I was alone. I found another job, and though I still think about the night, I try not to dwell on it too much. Have any of you had similar experience in abandoned or old buildings? Share it here. Thanks for listening to my story. I am still shaken up, and I hope that by sharing this, I might get some advice or at least find some understanding what happened to me. What I experienced last night was something straight out of a nightmare, and I can't seem to shake it off. Here's what happened. I have been driving all day. It was a long haul from a job in the middle of nowhere to my home. I usually take a shortcut through a series of back roads to avoid the traffic and make it home quicker. Normally, it's a pretty uneventful drive, but last night, that was different. The sun had just set, and it was getting darker quickly. I had about an hour left on this lonely stretch of road that wind through dense forest and barely any lights. I was trying to stay alert, but the monotony of the drive was making me drowsy. I was maybe 20 minutes from my home when my headlight caught something strange. It looked like a person standing by the side of the road, almost like they were waiting for a ride or something. I slowed my truck down, my instincts on high alert. The person was wearing what looked like an old, tattered clothes and was standing completely still. It was so dark that I couldn't make out any more details. As I got closer, the figure turned and started walking into the woods. I thought about stopping to check if they needed any help, but something felt off. They moved too smoothly, like they were gliding rather than walking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept on driving, trying to shake off the unease. A few minutes into the drive, I noticed something else. My truck's radio started acting up. It was picking up static and strange noises that I never heard before. I tried to adjust it, but the static wouldn't stop. Then I heard what sounded like a distorted voices. Voices that seemed to be whispering, but I couldn't make any word out of it. I thought maybe it was interference from nearby equipment or something. I tried to ignore it and focus on the road. The woods on either side of the road were thick and dark, make it hard to see beyond the trees. Then I saw it again, the same figure from before, now standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat. I slammed on the brake and skid to a stop. The figure was just standing there, unmoving. I honked the horn, but there was no response. In a panic, I put the truck in reverse and tried to turn around, but the figure suddenly moved. It wasn't walking, it was more like it was gliding towards me. The face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its gaze. My truck's engine roared as it rode into a gear and sped away. The road seemed endless. The woods seemed to close in around me as far as I went. The shadows stretching and shifting around my truck. I felt like I was being watched all the time. The radio noise grew louder, and the whispers turned into agonized cries. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I kept feeling like something was darting just out of sight, moving along with my truck and keeping the speed. I finally spotted a small rundown diner on side of the road. I pulled in, desperate for a place to stop and rest. The diner was closed, but I figured I could wait there until I calmed down and keep my nerves under control. I parked near the entrance and sat in the truck, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the other side of the truck. I turned on the interior light, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, though rhythmic and persistent. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. I decided to check outside. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly got off the truck, shining the beam around and looking. There was nothing visible, but the tapping had stopped. I was about to head back inside to my cabin. That's when I saw it. A set of deep scratches on the passenger side door. They were fresh, like they had been made moments ago. I got back in the truck and locked the door. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. The static on the radio was still there, and the whispers never completely faded. Every time I thought about getting out, I heard the tapping again, always from different spots around the trucks. Finally, as dawn began to break, I mustered the courage to drive off. I didn't stop for anything and took the main highway back home. I'm still not sure what I saw or heard last night. The figure, the whispers, and the scratches. They didn't make any sense. When I got home, I checked online for any similar reports in that area. I found a few threads from local talking about strange occurrences and sightings of shadowy figures in the woods. They mentioned old stories about creatures that can imitate humans and lead people into the forest. They called them skinwalkers. I'm not sure if that's what I encountered, but the fear I felt was real. If anyone has any insights or has experienced something similar, please share. I don't want to go near those roads again, and I am hoping that by sharing this, I can get at least some clarity. Thanks for listening to my story. I have a haunting story to share that's bound to give you chills. This one comes from a small Navajo community in the New Mexico, where a series of disturbing events led to a chilling confrontation with the terrifying skinwalker. If you are into dark folklore and supernatural tales, you will want to stick around for this one. The story takes place in a small village in northern New Mexico, surrounded by stunning yet rugged landscape of the high desert. It was a small community where everyone knew each other and respect the old traditions. However, tensions were high due to a land dispute between two families, which had been simmering for months. Things took a dark turn when a respected elder from one of the families was found dead under a mysterious circumstances. Although the official case of the death was deemed accidental, whispers of the dark magic and skinwalkers began to circulate. For those who are unfamiliar, a skinwalker is a type of witch from Navajo mythology, known for its ability to transform into animals and wield malevolent powers that are used to harm others. Tom, a local sheriff, started noticing strange occurrences around the village. Animals were acting strangely, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him wherever he went. One night, while heading home from a late night shift, he saw his neighbor Joe standing in his yard, staring blankly at the horizon. When Tom approached him, Joe was unresponsive and his eyes were glanced over. When he touched him, Joe collapsed, muttering about a skinwalker seeking revenge. Over the next few days, the village was plagued by eerie happenings. People reported seeing a shadowy figure lurking around their homes at night, hearing strange noises, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. It quickly became clear that the community was dealing with something supernatural, something beyond our understanding. With growing fear, the villagers turned to a local shaman, a respected figure known for his knowledge of the old ways and the legends. The shaman performed rituals and protective ceremonies to ward off the skinwalker, but the attacks only intensified after that. People began experiencing more frequent and terrifying encounters, including sightings of the shadowy figure and unsettling noise at night outside of their house. One particularly stormy evening, the skinwalker made his presence known in a dramatic way. Tom and several villagers witnessed the creature, a shape-shifting figure that blended human and animal traits. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it moved with an unnatural speed and agility. The attacks grew more violent, and the village was plagued into the fear and the chaos. Determined to confront the skinwalker, Tom and a group of brave villagers set out to find it. They followed the creature's track to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of the village. The house was a descriptive and filled with remains of dark rituals. Inside the old house, they discovered a hidden chamber adorned with symbols and artifacts related to dark magic. They spent some time in the dark old house. That's when they realized they was not alone in there. As the skinwalker emerged from the shadows, it was clear that this would be a formidable fight. The skinwalker's ability to shift forms made it difficult to predict its next move and defend against its attacks. The villagers, armed with protective charms and guided by the shaman, fought back with everything they had. The battle was intense and terrifying, with the skinwalker using its shape-shifting ability to disorient and attack. However, the villagers' unity and determination proved to be their greatest strength. Through the sheer courage and the guidance of the shaman, they managed to drive off the skinwalker away. The defeat of the skinwalker brought a sense of relief to the village, but the damage had been done. The elder's death remained a painful reminder of the events, and the land dispute was finally resolved. But it left behind lingering mistrust and fear. The community had been through a harrowing ordeal, but they emerged stronger and more united. Tom's story serves a haunting reminder of the power of ancient legends and the dark forces that can emerge from unresolved conflicts. It underscores the importance of courage, unity, and respect for the supernatural elements woven into the fabric of our world. I have been debating whether or not to share this story, but I think it's time. It's a terrifying experience that stuck with me for a while, and I hope it serves as a warning for those who might wander into places they shouldn't. A few months ago, I set out on a solo camping trip to a secluded forest area in Arizona. The place was recommended by a friend who knew I was an outdoors enthusiast. It was described as a pristine, untouched forest, perfect for peaceful getaways. I drove out early in the morning, winding along a narrow, unpaved road that snaked through the dense forest. The drive was beautiful, but desolated, with only the occasional deer crossing on the road and the thick canopy of leaves overhead blocking out the sun. By late afternoon, I reached the campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent and started a fire in few minutes, hoping to enjoy a tranquil evening away from the outside world. As night fell, the forest around me was swallowed by the shadows. The fire cast a warm glow, but the darkness beyond was almost impenetrable. As I sat by the fire, the stillness of the forest was occasionally broken by the sound of leaves rustling or the distant call of an animal. It was a peaceful night until the silence was disturbed by something strange, something I never thought I will occur. It started as a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the edge of the forest. I assumed it was some animal, perhaps a woodpecker or a squirrel, but the tapping was inconsistent and irregular. It was almost like the sound of something dragging across the ground, an unsettling pattern that didn't match any natural forest noise. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the comfort of the warm flames. But the tapping grew louder and louder by each second passing, more deliberate, and seemed to be coming closer. It was as if something was circling the perimeter of the clearing around my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and I walked toward the edge of the light. I shined the beam into the darkness, but all I could see was the dense blackness of the trees and the tangled underbrush. The tapping ceased abruptly, leaving the only oppressive silence of the night. I stood there, feeling a creeping unease, and then I heard something else, a soft, indistinct murmur that seemed to drift from the shadows, carried by the wind all around the forest. I took a few steps back, closer to the fire, trying to shake off the discomfort I'm feeling that moment. But the murmuring continued, growing fainter and then louder, as if someone was trying to speak to me from the darkness. The whispers became clearer, though the words were still unclear. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with me in a language I couldn't understand. The sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, echoing through the trees, though I couldn't see what was causing them, but it grew louder. Few minutes later, I heard a voice, a deep, broken whisper that was almost too quiet to hear. It said, "Come out, come closer." The voice was twisted and alien, as if it came from a place beyond the natural world. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I turned back to the tent, but the feeling of being watched persisted, as if unseen eyes were following me on my every move. The forest was still, but the air was charged with an unseen threat that I never felt before. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imaginations, but the sense of dread only grew more stronger. I sat by the fire, clutching a stick and staring into the darkness, waiting for the noise to stop. The murmuring and the tapping continued, a rhythmic and almost hypnotic pattern that played on my nerves. I could hear something moving just beyond the edge of the forest, its presence marked by subtle shifts in the shadows. I heard a sharp crack, a loud sudden noise that shattered the unease. I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight wildly around the campsite. The beam revealed nothing but the dark forest. As I stood there, frozen in fear, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was tall and thin, with limbs that moved in an unnatural and jerky manner. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeleton frame. It had hollow, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light from the fire, and its presence was a void in the night. The figure stood still, watching me with an unsettling stillness. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of discordant voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but seeing one was a different kind of terror. This creature seemed to be a dark mirror of humanity, something twisted and creepy. The figure slowly raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed directly at me. The gesture was slow and deliberate, and it filled me with a primal fear that I couldn't ignore anymore. The murmuring grew louder, becoming a barrage of voices begging, cursing, and threatening me. I backed away from the fire, my legs moving on instincts as I stumbled toward my car. The figure followed me, moving silently but with a deliberate intent. I felt its gaze on me, a suffocating weight that pushed me faster through the darkness. After running through the forest, eventually I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Still, I could hear the figure moving closer than ever, the sound of its footsteps growing louder as I struggled to get inside of my car. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The growl that came from the forest was slow and menacing, a sound that promised violence. Nonetheless, I started the engine and sped away, the gravel road crunching beneath the tires as I fled from the forest. I drove back to the civilization, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened to me. What did I just witness? I could still hear the whispers in my ears and see the dark figure's eyes in my mind. The memory of that night is a constant reminder of the darkness that can dwell in the wilderness. I haven't returned to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. The forest holds a darkness that I can't ignore, and the shadows of that night continue to haunt me till this day. If you ever go camping in a forest, if you are solo, then be aware of your surroundings. Hi guys, I have been wanting to post this for a while now, but I never post anything on online until now. I am not one for ghost stories or paranormal stuff, but something happened to me a few years ago that I can quite explain to this day. I thought I had share it here and see if anyone else had similar experience. This happened back in 2018 when I was still in college. My friend Sam and I were looking for a summer rental since we had a few months off from school and wanted to escape the city. We found this old farmhouse on the outskirts of the town. It was pretty cheap for how big it was, and the pictures looked charming enough. Little did we know that there was a reason for the low rent. When we had first arrived there, the place was beautiful in a creepy, nostalgic kind of way. It was a big, two-story house with a wraparound porch, old wooden floors, and antique furniture. The kind of place you would see in a black and white movie. It had been vacant for quite a while, so it was dusty and needed some cleaning. But that was a part of the charm, right? We spent the first day cleaning it up, unpacking, and getting settled. Everything seemed fine, just a bit eerie because how old the house was. The previous owner, Mr. Thompson, had passed away a few months before, and his family had put it up for rent. They were nice enough, but you could tell they were eager to get rid of this place. That first night, we were exhausted from moving all our stuff in and just wanted to crash. Sam went up to her room on the second floor, and I took the guest room on the main floor. Everything was quiet and peaceful until around 2 a.m. I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. I thought it was Sam, so I just went back to sleep, not giving any mind to it. But then the footsteps continued, and they were loud, like someone was walking back and forth. I got up to check on Sam, but her door was closed and there was no light coming from under it. I knocked a few times, and eventually she opened the door, looking confused. She hasn't been up, and there were no other signs of anyone being there. We went back to sleep, but neither of us slept well that night. We kept hearing those footsteps, sometimes even louder. Sometimes it got soft. It was like someone was pacing back and forth up there, but we couldn't figure out why. The next day, we talked about it and tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling or the wind making some noise. We didn't want to jump to ghost conclusions right away, so we tried to ignore it and went about our day. Over the next few weeks, things started to get stranger. It wasn't just footsteps. We heard door crack open and close by themselves. And sometimes we find things moved around. It was subtle stuff at first. A book out of its place, a chair shifted a little, but then it got more obvious. One night, I came home to find the lights in the kitchen flickering on and off, even though no one had been there. One of the creepy incidents happened when Sam and I were sitting on the porch late at night. We were chatting and laughing, trying to ignore the unease we felt about the house. We heard this soft, mournful sound like someone was crying in the distance. We both went inside to check, but there was nothing, just the usual creaks and groans of the old house. One night, things took a turn. Sam was out with her friends, and I was alone. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard a loud crash from the upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to check it out. I was nervous, but I told myself it was probably just something that had fallen over. When I got up to the stairs, the hallway was dark, but I could see that one of the doors was slightly open. I went down the hallway to see what had just happened, and that's when I saw it. The door to the room at the end of the hall was wide open, and the room itself was empty. I walked in and noticed that a picture frame had fallen off the wall and shattered on the floor. As I was cleaning up the mess, I felt a cold breeze blow past me. The air in the room went icy, and I started shivering. I looked around, but there was no open window or door that could explain the cold draft. I finished the cleaning as fast as I could and went back downstairs. The night I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me jump. I finally fall asleep on the couch, only to be woken up by Sam coming in the front door. She noticed that I was on the couch and asked if everything was okay. I told her what happened, and she seemed just as freaked as I was. Then we decided that it was probably time to do some research on this place. We visited the local library and dug through old newspapers and records. We found out that Mr. Thompson had lived alone for many years and that the house had a long history before him, including a fire that killed a family in the 1800s. That was unsettling to say the least, but it didn't give us many answers that we seeked for. One night, we decided to try something a little different. We set up a camera in the hallway and left a voice recorder running to see if we could capture anything by any chance. We didn't expect that much, but we were curious. The next day, when we were reviewing the footage, we were shocked. In the video, we could see a shadow figure moving across the hallway. It was hard to make out any details from the video, but it was clearly a figure that was not us. And on the audio recording, there was a faint whispering sound. We played it back several times, tried to make out what it was saying, but it was too faint to understand. After that, things seemed to be settled down a bit. The footsteps suddenly stopped, and we didn't hear any more crying or any more moving objects. It was like whatever had been there was satisfied with just making itself known and then leaving us alone. By the end of the summer, we were ready to move out. We didn't have any more major incidents, but the unease was always there. When we packed up our things, we couldn't shake the feeling that someone still watching us. To this day, I still wonder about the place. Was it really haunted, or we were just imagining things? I don't know. But it was one of the creepiest experiences that happened in my life all over the year. So guys, has anyone else had similar experience in an old house or a farmhouse? I am curious to hear your stories and thoughts. Maybe I'm not alone in this. Be safe. Bye. Hi there. I want to share something that happened to me a few years ago. I'm not really sure what to make of it, but it was one of the scariest things I have ever experienced in my life so far. A few years back, my family and I went to visit my grandparents. They lived in this really old house in a really small town, and it was always give me creeps. The house was huge, with creaky floors, long hallways, and a basement that was always locked. One night, I was staying over and decided to go to the bed early. I was in the guest room on the second floor trying to fall asleep. The room was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind blowing through the old windows. I had just closed my eyes when I heard it, a soft, dragging noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it might be the house settling in, or it was a small animal. But then I heard it again. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going on and on. and it was like dragging was getting closer and closer to my door, then moving away again. I was too scared to get off the bed, so I just lay there, hoping it would stop. After a while, the noise stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I even got up and checked the hallway, but there was nothing there. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake that feeling I was being watched. The next morning, I was still pretty shaken up. I mentioned the noise to my grandma, and she got really quiet. She told me that she had heard similar noises before, but didn't want to worry us kids. She said she thought it was probably the house too. That night, I tried to sleep, but I was on the edge the whole time. Around midnight, I heard the dragging noise again, but this time it was even louder, more persistent. I could hear it moving up and down through the hallway, just like before. I wanted to go downstairs to see if someone was up, but I was too scared to leave the room, even my bed. Finally, I managed to fall asleep, and the next morning I was so relieved to get out of the house. I didn't tell my grandpa or my parents about the noises because I didn't want them to freak out. But I never been able to forget that night. I'm still thinking about it sometimes and wonder what that noise was. Was it just an old house making noises, or was something there more sinister going on? I guess I will never know, but it was definitely an experience I wouldn't forget. Has anyone else had similar experience in an old house? I am curious to know if there an explanation for these kind of things, or if I was just imagining things from the thin air. Hey everyone, this is my first time sharing something this personal and unsettling. I hope you are ready for a spine chilling tale that's as real as it's eerie. This happened to me about a year ago in the dense forest of northern Arizona, where I had a terrifying encounter with what I can only describe as a skinwalker. For context, I was living in a small remote village near the national forest, a place known for its stunning landscapes and deep woods. The village was close knit, with a deep respect for the land and the old ways of its culture. The stories of skinwalkers and other supernatural beings were passed down through generations. And while most people treat them as merry legends, there was always an undercurrent of fear. I was out there gathering herbs one afternoon, something I did often to help with my herbal remedies. The weather was perfect for a hike: crisp air, clean skies, and the vibrant colors of autumn leaves. It was the kind of day that made you appreciate the beauty of the nature around you. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed a set of unusual footprints on the ground. They were large and oddly shaped, almost as if they had been made by something that walked on two legs, but with an unnatural stride. I shrugged it off as an animal trail and continued my search for the herbs. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sound of wildlife faded away, replaced by an unsettling silence, and moments after, I heard it, a faint mournful whisper that seemed to drift on the wind. It sounded like my name being called. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The whispering grew louder and more insistent, almost as it was beckoning me to follow the whispers. Despite my growing unease, I decided to follow the sound. The whispers led me further into the forest, and I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. My flashlight, which I had been working perfectly fine, suddenly flickered and went out, plugging me into the darkness and the loneliness. That's when the whispers turned into a low guttural growl. My heart raced as I felt chilling presence closing in around me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to changing around me, making it impossible to find my way back. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, and I felt as though something was following me, a larger being. In a desperate bid for safety, I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin that I had never seen before in the forest. It looked decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. With no other options, I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside the cabin. The air was misty, and the interior was filled with dust and cobwebs. I quickly barricaded the door with an old wooden table and huddled in the corner, trying to stay quiet as possible. The growling continued outside, accompanied by the scratching sound against the door and the windows. It was clear that whatever was out there wanted to get in and find me. The whispers returned, now more distinct and menacing. "Let me in," the voice said. "I need to speak with you." The tone was mocking and threatening at the same time, and it sent shivers down my spine. I don't know how many times I spent in the hours passed, and I remained in the cabin, terrified and exhausted. The scratching and growling eventually stopped, and the silence was almost as oppressive as the noises had been. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The forest seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened before. I made my way back to the village, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered around me. I never spoke about the encounter, but the experience left me with a profound respect for the legends of the skinwalker. The forest, once a place of peace, had become a place of fear and darkness. To this day, I avoid going out in the woods alone and at night. This experience taught me to take the old stories seriously and trust my instincts. If you ever find yourself in a situation where something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. The legends of skinwalkers might be more than just tales. They could be warning of something far more darker than we know. I'm sharing this because I need to get it off my chest. Even though it's hard to talk about, I am not the best writer. But what happened to me was so frightening that I feel like I have to share it. Here's what happened. Last month, I took a job as a handyman for a family friend. They owned an old ranch on the edge of vast forest in northern Arizona. It was a pretty straightforward gig, fixing fences, painting barn, that kind of thing. I was supposed to stay in a small guest house on the property, which was as remote as you could get. The ranch was surrounded by dense trees and had been abandoned for years before the family decided to fix it up and move back. They told me the place had a history, but they didn't go into any details. I thought it was just a local folklore to scare the tourists. I arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon, just as the sun was settling. The ranch house was huge and old, with broken windows and overgrown gardens. The guest house was a tiny building behind the ranch, isolated and half covered in vines. As night fell, I settled into the guest house. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped quickly. I tried to ignore the eerie cracks of the old house and focused on my work for the next day. Around midnight, I was lying in my bed, trying to sleep, when I heard something strange outside. It started as a faint scratching sound, like someone dragging their nails across the wood of the main house. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder and more persistent. I got up and looked out the window, but all I saw was the darkness of the forest and the faint glow of the moon through the trees. The scratching stopped suddenly. I was left with the uncomfortable silence of the night. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sounds outside kept me awake. I began to hear something else, an eerie, rhythmic tapping against the side of the guest house. It was too regular to be random, and it felt almost like a heartbeat. Then I heard it, a voice calling from the darkness. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. The voice was low and raspy, almost like it was whispering through the wind. It sounded like someone saying, "Help me," over and over again. I opened the door a little crack, peering into the darkness, but I saw nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, walking towards the source of the sound. The tapping grew louder, and I felt a chill crawling up my spine. I shined the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long limbs and a face that seemed to shift and distort in the shadows. Its eyes were dark voids that seemed to stare right through me. I froze, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure moved unnaturally, its limbs stretching and bending in a way that defied nature. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The voice was still out there, now coming from different directions, as if the figure was trying to draw me in the deceitful sounds. It mimicked the voice of a child crying for help, but the tone was twisted and wrong and unhuman. I backed away, stumbling back to the guest house. The figure stayed at the edge of the forest, keep staring at me, just out of the reach of the flashlight beam, watching me with those empty eyes. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. Inside, I listened to the sound of the forest and the scratching, the tapping, and the mournful cries. I could hear the figure moving around the guest house, dragging its feet and scraping against the wall. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I stayed up all night, too afraid to go back to sleep. When the morning finally came, I checked the outside of the guest house. There were claw-like scratches on the wooden walls, and strange, almost human-like tracks leading into the forest. I didn't wait for the family to show up for my scheduled work. I packed up my things and left the ranch as quickly as I could. I drove straight back to the town, my nerves on the edge the entire way. When I got home, I did some researches and learned about skinwalkers, the legend from the Navajo culture. Described them as malevolent witches who can take on the form of animals or humans to deceive and harm others. The story matches what I had seen, the unnatural movements, the mimicking voices, the deep sense of dread. I haven't been back to the ranch ever since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I often wonder what would have happened if I had stayed out there any longer. So, if you are in the middle of the forest, be aware of your surroundings. Maybe you are not alone. Hope you guys like this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to this channel. Enable the bell icon so you don't miss new uploads. And also check out other videos in this channel too. Like them and share them. And if you have any suggestions or any improvements I need to make in this channel, please post them in the comment section. Till next time, this is Malayali Wendigo. Bye.